my students wouldn't be able to enter into it with much fruitfulness if there weren't a guide like me there to help them and encourage them and to help them actually read what the text is saying and understand it in its own terms. With Plato the pagan, he recognized that there was still this possibility for human beings to enter into reality in such an intimate relationship, such that you and reality become one.
Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. This is a show all about ideas, about how we can rebuild a collapsing culture. My guests all have the credentials, the wisdom, the experience to say something meaningful, to contribute to the rebuilding of our moment. Season 9 is going to be our best season yet. Enjoy. Today, my guest is Dr. Thaddeus Kozinski. Dr. Kozinski is the author of Words, Concepts, Reality, Aristotelian Logic for Teenagers, published by En route Books and Media, Modernity as Apocalypse, Sacred Nihilism and the Counterfeits of Logic with Angelico Press, and The Political Problems of Religious Pluralism and Why Philosophers Cannot Solve It with Lexington Books. His latest book published this year is COVID-19 and the War Against Reality, also with En route Books and Media. He teaches philosophy at John Adams Academy and Memoria College and Great Books for Angelicum Academy. We met after sparring on X about something. I don't even remember what, but we got into a great conversation about it. And then that turned into talking about great books. And today we'll be discussing Plato's Republic. Dr. Kozinski, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thank you, Josh. Nice to be here.
Well, before we get into it, help us know you a little bit. Tell us a bit of your story. How did you get into teaching? What all do you do? I know you, I listed several places, and then I know you've also been at Wyoming Catholic along the way. Help us know you a little bit. What's your background?
Yeah, sure. Just one quick thing. My camera is in the bottom left corner of my screen for some reason, my laptop. So I'm going to look at you while I'm talking, but my eyes might be somewhere else. So hopefully that's okay. Right now I'm just looking at you, and that's easiest for me to talk. Okay.
Yep, that's fine.
So anyway, yeah, I first encountered like philosophy and theology senior year in college at Villanova, and then I got really interested in continuing and kind of redoing my education, feeling like I hadn't had a classical education. I wanted it, but I was already a graduate of a college. I had a pre-med kind of degree, in the sciences and math. And then I found out about the whole classical world, and they had a great books master's at St. John's College, Annapolis. So I went there and met my wife there. She was going there for similar reasons. And I really just read through the canon and learned about Socratic method, and especially Plato. Yeah, I fell in love with Plato. Was able to work on the Meno in the original Greek and work on translating that at St. John's. That was a great experience. And so I thought, maybe I'll keep going. And Catholic U was a great next step, because they took the St. John's College Masters in Liberal Arts as a philosophy master's, which was pretty amazing. So I didn't have to do another master's in philosophy, right to the PhD program. And since then, I've been teaching at different levels and places and schools, and writing and thinking more about classical education and particularly Christian or Catholic classical education. I've taught in secular environments and intentionally Catholic environments, and so I'm still doing that today, still teaching and still reading the Republic and teaching it. I teach a moral and political philosophy course at a charter school called John Adams Academy. And they have a philosophy course. And it's been great to teach juniors, the classics of ethics and politics. And so that's what I've been doing.
Oh, that's amazing. I think
decades.
It fascinates me that so many people have a version of that story where they get to some point in adulthood and they realize that their education, through nobody's fault in a way. I mean, it's not like there is some nefarious committee somewhere thinking, I'm going to ruin your education. But you just get to this certain point and realize, I actually have never encountered the real sources of wisdom. I've never even learned that it matters for my personal fulfillment as a human being that I am concerned with questions of justice and happiness and purpose, and that there is this whole tradition of thinkers before me who've considered these questions, and that to be educated is to be conversant in their answers and to be able to weigh and evaluate them. And so I meet a lot of adults who have some version of that story, and I'm encouraged that there is something of a renaissance of classical education, certainly happening in the K-12 world, but also increasingly in adult education options as well. I know Memorial College has a master's program. University of Dallas, Hillsdale College has a master's program. I lead a certificate program with Thales College that is oriented towards adults who make that same sort of realization. And there's a huge group of people who have that kind of moment. And it's exciting to me that there are options now when people have that kind of realization. It's not that they're like, oh, well, dag nabbit, it's too late because I'm now 32 or 45 or 65. I can never go back. There actually are ways people can kind of recover some of that lost opportunity today.
There sure are. It's never too late. It's tricky. Once you're an adult, you've solidified some intellectual habits and ways of thinking, and you have to unlearn quite a bit. But there's some good programs out there. I teach at the Memorial College one now. I've done a few classes for them, and it's a great program for adults to want to, after they've have a college degree. A lot of them, yes, have had this experience of what they've missed and lost. I think it happens too with religious conversions and experiences. One recognizes a certain depth of traditional wisdom and liturgy and things that they've been haven't experienced, and they find it in certain milieus. And I think there is a lot of a return to the sources, ressourcement, and a kind of understanding that modernity is missing quite a bit. And I think, we're going to talk about the Republic, but there's no other book that exemplifies this experience, this metanoia, change of mind, periagoge, conversion, turning around. And the Republic is like a book that has successfully, inspired such experiences and been a catalyst. It was for me, and it still is every time I read it. I should also add the Plato's Laws, which I've only read somewhat recently. It's a pretty daunting book. It's longer than the Republic, and it's not as exciting dramatically and stylistically, but I taught it for a voluntary great books organization called the Catherine Project. They're out of St. John's College, and I did a summer tutorial on Plato's Laws. Okay, now I'm going to read this book finally and read all about it, and it was an amazing experience. You have to read the Laws as a sequel to Republic at some point. It's necessary, but that's a conversation for another show.
Well, I say we may have to have you back on the show to do Plato's Laws. And I'll reread the Laws because I've read enough of Plato's Republic that I at least feel able to ask questions reasonably without having reread the thing for today. But the Laws I'm less familiar with. I had a professor.
Almost everybody, same experience of almost everybody. Yeah.
I had a professor at Faulkner University who insisted. I'm sure this, like most facts about ancient authors, is up for dispute, but he at least maintained that the Republic was most likely written by Plato as a young man, and the Laws is most likely written by Plato as an older man. So
that's true. Yeah, I think that's been proven.
The maturing of thought there.
Oh yeah.
That's a great natural segue. So I'm just gonna kind of take that and get us into Plato. So I went upstairs before our recording today, and I pulled off my copy at home of Plato from the Great Books set. But I also found two books that I think probably reflect most people's experience with Plato. I have at my home library one copy of a secondary source on Plato, Eric Havelock's Preface to Plato. It's a dense philosophical monograph that asserts there's a lot of background information that you need. But I also have a book that a friend gave me a few years ago, Plato and a Platypus Walk into a Bar. And it just, it's also a pretty solid, very decent book of philosophy, but it takes a humorous route there. Now, I'm sure everybody in our audience tonight and those who will listen to it when we release this in the fall has heard of Plato, but they probably have a lot of different experiences with that. So before we get into the Republic proper, could you set the stage for us? Do we need a ton of background information? Is there any absolutely necessary background information? What do we need to really appreciate the Republic?
Yeah. It really does. I don't know if there's a we that I could identify. There's different readers at different levels of consciousness, of liberal arts skills and experience of close reading of classic texts, of emotional, spiritual, psychological maturity and balance and level of virtue. It's almost like, what do I need to read the Bible? I mean, it's almost like that. In many ways, it's infinitely not like that, because the Bible is revealed sacred scripture. But in terms of, entering into this text, I don't know. I know that my students wouldn't be able to enter into it with much fruitfulness if there weren't a guide like me there to help them and encourage them and to help them actually read what the text is saying and understand it in its own terms. Of course, there's in a sense, you need to understand something of the history of ideas and the role of Plato in those ideas, and the history of philosophy and Plato's predecessors and what he was doing and what Greek culture, Athenian culture was like, and go on and on. Sometimes you get these kind of overviews in the introductions. There's the famous introduction in Alan Bloom's version of the Republic, which is very comprehensive and informative. And so, it's not easy to answer that in a formula. Just like any text, it has a context. A text has a tradition behind it. It has a tradition of interpretation. And, you don't have to be a scholar of Plato or the Greeks to get a lot out of the Republic, but you really also shouldn't treat it as this standalone, self-sufficient text that you could just come at and encounter, without prejudice or bias. And I'm not really a proponent of the St. John's model, which is to say, never read introductions, never read any scholarship, never read secondary sources. I understand why that works in terms of the seminar discussion, because everybody's on the same page. But in terms of just reality itself, not just in this particular practice of seminar discussion, it does help to have that context. I don't think the concepts are, literally speaking, on the literal level, are that difficult. It's written in a sense for a popular audience, you might say. It's dramatic. There's excitement. There's a lot to get on a superficial level. But there's also depth in the Republic that are analogous to depths of Scripture. I mean, again, analogous, a lot different from Scripture, but there's a profundity with this text, because the purpose of the dramatic mode of writing, among other things, is to enable the reader to enter into the dialectic, enter into the experience of Socrates and, in a sense, the good, the forms, enter into it emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, spiritually, such that the words on the page not only lead you to deep truths and ideas, but a kind of deep, intimate encounter with the reality of which these words are just mere symbols always and descriptors. It's really meant to be a kind of mystical text, in my opinion.
I think that's a helpful way to kind of come at it, because you hit two different extremes that I've heard people do. And on the one hand, I know some folks who go so far into the academic side that they would almost set up an immense barrier to say there's no way you can get to this text unless you have read all of these secondary sources. And I don't think that's true. There's got to be a middle ground. When I would teach this to high school juniors, we would usually start with kind of three basic pieces of information. We need to talk about the sophist, because those are Socrates' interlocutors. And the way we set this up in context, my students had most of them had read The Trial and Death of Socrates in 9th grade. And then we're coming back to say, okay, here is Plato, Socrates' student, setting up Socrates' kind of core method and demonstrating that method here in the Republic. And thirdly, I usually would hit on something you mentioned a moment ago. This is not just a set of ideas that we're supposed to like analyze. This is not in the Thales Academy sequence. We would do a lot of analysis as part of 10th grade logic. But in philosophy, we're trying to actually consider, well, what if these ideas are true? And then how do we determine if they're true? And that really is a different question. And Plato, I think Plato's, you use that word dialectic that we don't use often outside of classical ed circles, but it's something I think that text brings us into, the whole kind of cut and thrust of ideas, never with a relativistic angle, but always with the goal of pursuing truth through dialogue, through question, and through recognizing, well, I was wrong about that, but this part is true. So if this is true, let's go on one step further. And this, through Socrates' dialogues with his partners, there's sort of an ascent of the soul to truth in a way. And so I do think that Plato has this effect on careful readers that he, and I don't know anyone who agrees with everything Plato says. And even then, if you talk to enough people who love Plato, you get lots of different views about what Plato actually said. It's not that simple. But he definitely has this. It's the Republic, I think, is one of those books that does sort of change us as readers.
That's what it's meant to do. It's also an antidote. You mentioned relativism. The essence of the Republic is the difference between appearance and reality. So that there is a difference, and that we can transcend it. We can begin with how things appear to me and you, to us, partial, imperfect, incomplete, perhaps even unreal, erroneous, and somehow we can transcend that perspective and reach the way that being is in itself, per se. It seems paradoxical, because wait a minute, so you're knowing things as they are in themselves, but you're knowing it, there's a relationship there, that thing is related to you, you're the observer, then it's relative to you. You have a lens, you have a perspective. Okay, got it. But the mystery here is somehow the intuition of Plato, and this is where I think he's a genius and he's the father of all philosophy, is one has to recognize that human beings are meant to transcend mere appearances. And even though we remain as relative finite beings, there's a spiritual transformation that can occur simply through, it takes struggle. And if you bring in Christianity, you would add God's help and grace to this. But with Plato the pagan, he recognized that there was still this possibility for human beings to enter into reality in such an intimate relationship, such that you and reality become one. The good is not something you simply just know about and recognize and see partial images of, but you actually can somehow experience the good as it is in itself. You know, how the good itself might experience himself, you might say. This has parallels with mystical theology, of course. But I think that's the ultimate message. Thrasymachus in the book 1 is the proponent of the ineradicable relativity of knowledge. And if things are ineradicably relative, they're always just from your perspective. And if they're just only from your perspective, they're really just bound up with your desires and your ideas, and everyone is locked in to themselves. And at that point, there's nothing else but power dynamics. Mm-hmm. And everything's reduced to raw power. And that was the enemy for Plato. That was the sophists' underlying understanding. And that is today's understanding. Okay, that is underneath a lot of our dialogues and ideologies today, is the truth that nothing exists but power, and truth is the opinion of the powerful. The same evils and enemies, ruling enemies, that Plato was trying to subvert through his 36 or so dialogues, and also his actual work with some statesmen, which failed more or less. But what's lasting are these works, and they were meant to, well, you might say, just destroy or undermine that evil, the evil of believing that there is nothing but power. What he calls misology in the Phaedo, and he calls it misology, hatred of logos, is the greatest evil that human beings can commit, is to commit the sin of giving into this misology.
So the goal for Plato then is perception of the good, and that perception of the good is going to change how we live. I think you gave us I mean, there's so much happening in the Republic. I don't want to
put it this way, not so much perception of the good, but possession, union with, identification with, even transformation into. Because if you leave it at perception of, you're back to the relative. The absolute is Plato's subject matter. The absolute. And he uses relative finite things to get us there, namely words, images, symbols. These are all relative. But here's the mystery. The way that Plato choreographs them, orchestrates them, the shadows in the cave wall, have the effect, if you're disposed, if you desire it, to lead you up the ascent into the absolute. That's why I say it's akin to the Bible, right? Lectio Divina, reading the Bible, the Gospels has the same promise, right? Although in a much higher level with God's help. But again, that's another topic, the relation of Plato to the Christian revelation.
Well, there's certainly that really, I don't want to follow the tangent too far, but there is a whole delightful tangential conversation about, this is one of the reasons why the church fathers were very enamored with Plato. Augustine was thoroughly Platonist before his conversion, and he didn't reject all of the Platonic truth. I mean, I think he would probably say that Plato is a rich place to mine Egyptian gold and to steal the pagan truth from the pagans who don't really understand what they've discovered. And we Christians ought to take that truth and use it to ascend, for our soul's ascent to God.
Yes.
Plato saw, I think he saw much truly. But I want to, let's see if we can go through some of the specifics that Plato goes through, because he, part of what makes this text so helpful is that the Republic is very wide ranging. We've got questions, and this even gets to all kinds of other interpretive questions about some folks take the Republic as an actual political plan with quasi-communistic overtones. Socrates says it's a metaphor for the soul, but it sure does have some political components to the soul. But the biggest question, I think, that certainly is at the foreground of books 1 and 2 is the question of justice. So think for us for a moment, if you would, about what is justice, and why is justice so complicated that Socrates needs a giant city to really even begin approaching the question, much less the answer?
Yeah, well, this would be one of the things you'd have to help students understand, because when they hear the word justice, their view of it is peculiarly modern and legalistic and narrow, whereas it's one of the cardinal virtues for Plato. It's perhaps the virtue of virtues. According to Aristotle, it's the whole of the virtue. It's the total virtue. So justice is not simply some legal dictate. It has to do with the cosmos, with order itself. We're talking about the proper ordering of things. What is owed to others in a deep sense, spiritual, metaphysical, right relationship of the parts of the soul and the humans in the city. It's really the leitmotif of all classical literature. I mean, every single tragedy, the Greek tragedies and the epics had something to do with a kind of root injustice that led to these effects, which had to be addressed. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Oresteia, the Oedipal cycle. It's always about this kind of rip in the fabric of the cosmos, and how can we address it, recognize it, and repair it in some way. And so that is the question that begins pretty much the discussions in the Republic, which by answering leads Plato to delve into many other, you might say, larger topics, from the nature of the soul to the nature of politics to ultimately up to the nature of goodness itself and truth and being. All that is required to answer the question, what is justice? And, after all, what is the Christian, mystery all about? It's about the injustice of sin and how God had to become a man to satisfy and atone for that injustice. It's the whole purpose of Christianity, is to explain the injustice and the justice. What is justice? It's Jesus Christ's sacrifice, in embodying the good, and rectifying this rip in the moral and spiritual framework. So yeah, when you start thinking about justice, it is really the ultimate, the ultimate moral and spiritual kind of topic. So yeah, and I think Plato understood that very much.
I think you're right that students misunderstand that. I think, honestly, I was in a similar boat the first time I approached teaching Plato's Republic. I'd read books 1 and 2 before, and then it was years before I had a project that required me to read the rest of the Republic. And then I was like, there's so much more here. And I think I read the Republic, or sections of the Republic, before I read the Oresteia and the Oedipal cycle. And really reading Oedipus Rex helped me a lot with understanding what Plato's getting at, because Sophocles makes so clear that it is not just a violation, a crime in this case. Oedipus's crime is not just some violation of a social taboo. Right. It's not just some custom he's violated. There's actually something, it's hard to name, but it's easy to experience. But there's something real that has occurred where he has violated the moral fabric of the universe in conceiving children with his mother. And in doing that, there is this injustice that the cosmos and this is where I read Luc Ferry's book on myth and myth as a proto-philosophy. And he argued that this really, the idea of the cosmos and harmony in the Greek mind, is really necessary to fully understand what's happening in this philosophical quest for justice. Because the sense of justice is not just I've been wronged, but rather that's my shallow recognition that harmony has been broken. And justice is what is required for the right arrangements of the parts. And then that happens on an individual level within the individual when we're talking about the soul. And then it even happens on the whole social level, which is where I think that's part of what Socrates is getting at with the myth of the metals and showing the different arrangements of the necessary tasks of a city all fitting together harmoniously, where they each have their part to play. But this sense of justice is far richer than you stole, so it must be repaid. There's something deeper going on there that actually helps us know what it means to live the good life in far deeper and more complex ways.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's about what would be a standard for justice. Is that standard what people say and do and opine to be just? Or is there something beyond human opinion against the way things appear? I mean, that's kind of where he goes with this, right? Because, I mean, the question is justice, if you look into it with a kind of cynical mindedness and no one's looking and you're allowed to say it, you would say, you know what? No one really thinks justice is good, because justice really means you can't get everything you want and do everything you want. And you have to give stuff and suffer. And
argument.
Yeah, you have to kind of like restrict yourself, and nobody really wants to do that, but they will do it if there's some good reward for it, or if they get something from that restriction, or if they prevent some greater evil, then they'll do it. Then they'll be just. And that's why we have a reputation for justice, and that's why we promote it. But when it comes down to it, there isn't such a thing as justice. There simply is the material rewards from being thought just. And it's kind of emptiness at bottom. And this is the sophistical view. This is the nihilistic view of today, right? Everything is just power. There's no essences to things, or relativism, that justice in one country is different from another. There is no, form of justice, that there is no Tao, natural law. These are outdated, naive concepts. The same thing. It's all there in book 2, especially. The beginning of book 2 sets up the social contract view of Hobbes and Locke. It's right there. And that's the common sense view. This is what people do. They get together and agree on norms of justice out of self-interest, because they don't want to suffer too much. They'd like to murder everybody they can and get all the money and rape and pillage, but they know if they can do that, others can do it. And they might come out with the short end of the stick. So let's all to agree to restrict our passions and desires a bit, and let's call that justice. And the challenge is set up to Socrates. You need to deal with this argument, because to do that, you have to show us that justice would be something somebody would desire for its own sake. And the only way you could show me that is if someone who loves justice is treated as infinitely unjust, and he still chooses justice. And then he has the amazing image of the crucified man who is deemed unjust but loves justice. It's an incredible image, prophetic.
I think it's one of Plato's, real gifts, in the sense that he moves back and forth between kind of clear propositional logic in a way that Aristotle is going to definitely carry on. But then he also mixes in these images and myths that are just they're very memorable.
Yeah.
I'd have to think more about I don't know what to do with the prophetic nature of the crucified just man there. It's a very very clear Christ image that is happening 300-400 years BC still. But it's part of what I think is part of Plato's genius. It's another one of the tensions that runs throughout the Republic, because one of the most famous passages that at least comes up a lot in humanities circles is where Socrates famously says he would outlaw some poets from the Republic. He would not let the myth makers who tell these the immoral stories of the gods. They aren't allowed to be in the Republic. And yet at the same time, Plato throughout here is telling myth after myth after myth. He gives, I think it's either Thrasymachus or Polemarchus, the Ring of Gyges as a myth. You've got the myth of the metals. The allegory of the cave functions in a mythic way. There continue being these different myths throughout. And it's part of what, even if students reading Plato sometimes lose track of what exactly the core question is, they remember the images. And I think those images kind of work us over, and they maybe have some of that mystical effect that you were describing earlier.
Yeah, obviously Plato doesn't mean to outlaw poetry and poets, because he'd have to outlaw the Republic, which is a poem. It's a drama. It's a work of literature. And, I mean, it's that paradox is meant to wake you up and to make you question what he's getting at, right? And I don't know if you want to get into that issue. It has to do with, though, the main theme of the book, which is which knowledge and experience is going to be hegemonic, is going to be architectonic. Is it going to be the poet's imitations of the good, or is it going to be the good? And is it going to be a culture in which imitations and partial perspectives and relativity has the effect of leading its citizens away from the good itself and not even making one aware that these are imitations? Or is it going to be the kind of art and music and liturgy which has the effect of uniting you with that which those images are images? And how are we going to ensure the latter? Well, only through the master discourse of philosophy. And remember, Plato invented philosophy, okay? Like, I know they were pre-Socratics, okay? And they were, in fits and starts, trying to develop a conceptual language that was more precise and universal and less descriptive, more definitive, less poetic, mythopoetic, right? Yes, they were developing this. But the dialectic approach of Plato and his use of logic, and I mean, it just makes those pre-Socratics seem like kindergartners. He really invented the discourse. And of course, where did he get it from? He got it from looking and observing Socrates, who of course is the embodiment and true inventor of the dialectic. And it's the dialectic that needs to be superior, that needs to have kind of a pride of place as the authority. And when you read the laws, this really comes out. The way he sets up the guardians in the laws, the nocturnal council, and the role of argument that prefaces each law that's given. You can see, and of course, there's so much liturgy and poetry in the laws, but it's all under this. It's all under a transcendent discourse and liturgy, which is you might say underwritten by the highest level of discourse, which is theology ultimately. But this is a big mystery, right? You have on the one hand the Gospels, written for children to read in some ways. I mean, written at a very low level of abstraction, right? Commoners can read it. And then you have the Summa Theologia of St. Thomas. Now, which is higher? Well, ultimately, it begins and ends with the Gospels, right? Like, God himself communicated the highest reality through a narrative, not through a syllogistic dialectic. So this is a paradoxical topic. But again, what ultimately governs the readings of the gospel? It's dogma and doctrine, namely abstract, precise, definitive logos, right? That's the magisterium in the Catholic circles. And so you have this back and forth between the superiority of narrative and the superiority of dialectic, but they have to be in tension. And I think that's what Plato's getting at with his dealing with the poets, and what seems like a kind of denigration of them.
Oh, Well, Dr. Kozinski, you give me plenty to think about. I've not seen that much happening in that interaction. There's a lot going on there. I'm keeping an eye on our times. I know you've got class and not too long, but I would feel remiss if I didn't ask you to walk us through Plato's myth of the cave. I think that that is perhaps the one part of Plato that I think most people in classical education have read, or certainly it's the one that it's held out there as like, yep, you have to know this part of Plato if you don't know any other part of Plato. You got to know the Allegory of the Cave. I've heard that one sometimes used as an image of enlightenment, of education, of what philosophy is doing. What do you make of the Allegory of the Cave? How do all the pieces fit together?
Yeah, it's all the above. it's an uber allegory. It's a meta allegory. It serves so many purposes. I mean, literally, it's called "This is an image of education," Socrates says right before he articulates it. But education means enlightenment. It means to be led out, educare, to be ducere, like led out, ex ducere, right? In Latin. Led out of what to where? Salvation, enlightenment, ascent, knowledge, just knowledge. It's a metaphor for knowledge. What does knowledge mean? Let me explain. How about the difference between appearance and reality? There is a difference. Here it is. Let me explain to you the difference. Shadows are appearances of what they are shadows of. They should connect to the things they're shadows of. They should point to them. They're effects of those things. They are dependent on those things. They're not the things, right? Well, do you know that? What if you thought they were the things? What would you do? Could you detect that a shadow was a shadow if you only saw shadows? Imagine someone who can only see shadows, who's only ever saw shadows. Would he know that there's anything else? No. And that's what's depicted, right? The shadow watchers. They've been strapped from the birth in a cave looking at shadows. They can't turn their heads. They can't. It's hard to say if they even know anyone else is there because they can't turn their heads. We don't know if they can speak. They can see. They can only see what's right in front of them, and what's in front of them are the shadows on the walls. And these shadows are being projected by a fire behind them by people, some kind of group of people. We don't know who these are, but they're there. They're puppeteers, and they put the puppets in front of the fire, and they make noises, and they speak, and they project the shadows onto the wall in front of the prisoners who are shackled, like I said, and motionless. In a sense, they only see themselves because there's no perspective but their own. When you only have subjectivity with no objectivity and all you have is your own relative perspective, you might say you're completely motionless. You're completely suffocating in your own existence in the sameness of self. It's hell, basically, to be constantly without any experience of otherness. And that's their experience. And they're put there by somebody. But beyond the puppeteers is a ascent going upwards out of the cave to the real world with another light, the sun, and real objects. And in the allegory, there's somehow one of them escapes, and the way he escapes, somehow he's unshackled. He turns his head. We could leave it at that. Once he turns his head and faces what's causing the shadows, that's when the enlightenment begins. That's when perspective is shattered, and the potential for knowledge, for enlightenment, for salvation, liberation is possible. And so this is an endless metaphor, endless, inexhaustive. I mean, many of the listeners, teenagers, might be thinking of the television screen, the computer screen, the phone screen. Plato invented the television in a sense.
He could only have imagined virtual reality goggles. I mean, that we would voluntarily put ourselves in such a cave-like realm. I think and it seems to me that allegory connects very easily to what you were describing with Socrates' dialectic, because I think that's part of what, in every conversation that he has, Socrates, whether it's with Euthyphro or Polemarchus or any of his other ones, he's always trying to get people to have that moment where they turn their heads. And it's that I know there's a term for it that's slipping from my mind, but the
Periagoge.
That's the one. The moment in the conversation where there is this recognition that, like, actually I don't know, and that recognition of Socratic
Or
doubt.
aporia, maybe aporia. Is that what you're thinking of?
That's the one.
Yeah, aporia. Yeah.
Where just like suddenly admission of ignorance becomes the opportunity to turn and begin the ascent to knowledge. But as long as we are stuck in asserting that we have knowledge, we're right there locked in. We're remaining ignorant of even the possibility that there is more knowledge to be had.
I mean, there's two ways to say I don't know. One is I don't know and no one knows and nobody can know. That's the skeptic, right? And it's actually a kind of duplicitous admission, because you really know something. You're asserting the inability of knowledge, which is very arrogant. The better way is to say, when I say I don't know, what I mean is I recognize now that what I took to be a knowledge of the whole or an absolute perspective was actually just my particular perspective. And I realize now that it's incomplete. It's inaccurate to some extent. It may be accurate in a partial way, but insofar as I take it to be the whole, it's fake and wrong. And now I realize that what I think and how I understand this is incomplete, let's say. There's some truth I'm holding on to, something in my perspective that makes sense, but the way that I understand that perspective is wrong. Do you have access to the whole? Because if so, please help me. And remarkably, it does seem that Socrates had access to the whole. And Plato, that's how he was able to cause this aporia in others and guide them towards more and more recognition of the incompleteness of different partial perspectives. And ultimately, here's the question: can anyone, by their words, like directly construe for you the whole, so that in listening to them, you attain the whole? And I don't think so. And I think no particular word or idea or claim or argument can do it. But that doesn't mean that it can't happen. It's just that I mean, look, even I mean, Jesus's words himself couldn't secure knowledge of the Father. At some point, Peter says in the Caesaro, what is it? I forgot the name of the town. It's Caesaro something. I forgot. Caesaro Philippi. Yeah. When he confesses, "You are the Son of God," and Jesus says, basically he's like saying, "My words didn't do that. It was God, my Father, like communicating into your soul. It was neither my flesh nor anyone else's flesh. You had direct experience and encounter." But of course, what enabled that was the whole life of Christ and him witnessing it. What enables conversion is the experience of Socrates, and maybe several experiences, or reading all of the Republic and just digesting it and just reflecting on it. The whole thrust of this book is greater than the parts. The sum is greater than the parts, you might say. And I think that's what Plato meant when he wrote it, was to have it be a kind of sacrament in that sense. Anyway, yeah. That's what were we talking about? We were talking about the cave.
What happens when you get to a Socratic discussion?
Dialectic, right? Yeah, the cave.
But I think one quick comment back on Jesus. I was thinking Jesus at one point turns to his apostles and says, I've said all of these things in parables to masses, but to you I've said these things clearly. But each time when I reread the Gospels, I'm always struck by the fact that the apostles really don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Even though Jesus has said, I have said this to you, I have explained to you what I'm about, I've told you the Father's business, they still don't get it until the Holy Spirit comes and reveals all things. And they have to go through these experiences. But even then, even Jesus's words did not immediate apprehension of the fullness. Like on the Mount of Transfiguration, when they see Christ in as much of his glory on earth as possible, and they don't get it. And it's even Paul has that line about we see still through a glass dimly, even with as much clarity as he had. We could go on for a long, long time, which is one of the fun things about trying to talk to anybody about the Republic. There is just so much depth here. Last thing I wanted to ask you about. I think we have. If we're brief, we've got time on this. I'm gonna try to wrap.
I could probably go to 3:05 at the most. So we got 15 minutes.
Perfect. Talk to us a little bit about Plato's understanding of the soul, because I remember this. I think it's in book 5, but I know this much more from C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, and his Lewis uses the language of the head, the chest, and the belly. Yeah. But walk us through Plato's understanding of the soul and where that fits in the overall development of the idea of justice.
Yeah, he basically, has an interesting argument for why we think there might be parts of the soul, and it has to do with measuring and calculating and the way in which parts. It seems as if we have parts because awareness happens in different ways and in different modes, and we have conflict. Like we are hungry and we know we're hungry, but the hunger doesn't know it's hungry or something like that. Like the appetite itself isn't what's aware of this. It's something else that's aware of the appetite. So he gets into this again, this sort of like contrast. He's very, contrast helps in understanding things. Contrast between the shadows and the objects. So he begins with that, and eventually he gets to this what's called the tripartite, 3-part soul, and it's just such common sense thinking, but he puts it well. He has a lot of images of it. He has this many-headed beast, which is the lower part. He has a lion, which is the middle part, and he has a little man as the highest part. That's one of his images. In the Phaedrus, maybe he has the charioteer and the 2 horses, bad horse and good horse, and the charioteer, and so you've got the part of us that is in common with animals, namely appetites, and the spirited part. The spirited part, thumos in Greek, it's the competitive, it's the irascible appetites in Thomistic scholasticism, anger. It's where we feel anger and fear and pride and honor, and we want to own things and have ownership and say mine and not yours. And animals have this too. Okay, so it's not only human. The difference is that in humans, that spirited part can listen to reason, and not just mechanically the way that you can train a dog. It can actually has a participation in reason to some extent, and reason is the highest, right? The part of us that is aware, that seeks truth and the good, and basically should be in charge of the other parts. He relates these parts to the city. And I mean, he actually talks about this first as in the city, right? We haven't even talked about that, the creation of the city as a way of expressing something. I mean, is the creation of the city for its own sake, or is it simply used as an image to get at the soul? And is that even not for its own sake, but to get at the good? And I think it's the latter. I think the whole point of all these images, it is not meant to be an ideal city. And I think book 5, the absurdity of trying to put into practice some of these, trying to make the metaphor of the soul completely match the metaphor of the city, okay, leads to absurdities, leads to shocking inconsistencies, absurdities on purpose. And that's to tell us something, and
Hmm.
perhaps to tell us that never can we incarnate in matter in this world the good. We shouldn't really try to, but we should always try to love and know the good, but never try to like immanentize the eschaton, as Eric Voegelin famously said. So yeah, the soul is. I mean, the other image of the soul, which we haven't talked about, a lot of people don't talk about this, is Book 10. Book 10 is the afterlife. Did you know that Plato has a scary image of the afterlife that he gives us, the myth of and we get another understanding of the soul from there. In fact, we choose our souls in this weird limbo place, and then we enter into a new life with the soul we chose, and that's a whole nother beautiful, amazing image to help us. And he ends with it. In fact, I love teaching the myth of to the students. It's usually one of their favorite parts of the book. When are they going to make the movie of the Republic? I'd love to see that spindle, put into CGI.
Well, I don't know I don't think they included the myth of in this version, but I don't suppose you're familiar with a philosopher sci-fi author named Jo Walton.
No.
She I'd have to go. It's been a couple years since I've read her, so I'd have to go back and make sure I'm right about these details. But I'll put a link to this in the show notes in case anybody is interested when we put this episode out. But I believe she was a Boston College philosophy professor who kind of had a thought experiment that grew into a novel that grew into a trilogy. And the premise is that Athena and Apollo are real, and anyone across all of human history from roughly 300 BC forward who prays to Athena or Apollo gets zapped into Plato's Republic in like an Atlantis state outside of time. And They are tasked with building the actual Republic and putting it into practice. And it gives rise to a lot of the very absurdities that you're hinting at.
It sounds like a video game, like a role-playing game or something.
It may have started that way. I could totally imagine a group of philosophy master students getting together and coming up with the weirdest grad school D&D game, and then deciding we could sell this. Let's write this story down. As we're wrapping up today, I just want to mention two last things. It seems to me that all of this does tie together if we think about this in terms of like what exactly are we trying to do in education, particularly in classical education. But I think this is true of every good teacher, even if they're in a progressive system or some different educational system. In one sense, everything we do in teaching is trying to help students understand what exactly is a just life. How can you arrange your life in such a way that you are a just person pursuing justice in the city, in the world? We also want students to be ruled by reason. That's not to deny the existence of thumos or of the passions, but it is to say that we as human beings have something unique, and we call that reason, and we actually have better lives when reason governs the other parts of the soul. But I think all of that ultimately finds its telos in communion with reality. Education should produce students who are deeply in tune with the real and have begun a lifelong process of emerging from ignorance into communion with reality.
I can't put it better. That's well put. What else could I say? I think you're right. And I think maybe I could just add this, that a teacher has to recognize. What's interesting, I've been reading perhaps one of the best, maybe the best. I haven't read enough to say it's the best, but D.C. Schindler's a favorite author of mine. He's a philosopher.
And he's written a couple summers ago.
I believe his dissertation, which he turned into the book, is Plato's Critique of Impure Reason. I think it's Goodness and Truth in the Republic, something like that. But I've been reading that, and one of the key insights here is that the good or any form, but the ultimate form, the good, is so big and amazing and infinite and godlike that it can both account for itself and its appearances, and it includes its appearances. So in other words, it's not simply like you've got two realities. One is the appearances and one is the real. The real includes the appearances somehow. It's the way in which God can include his relations to us somehow, right? Because that would seem to limit him, right? Or how God could create relations within himself in the Trinity. It seems paradoxical that he would be dependent on himself in terms of the persons, right? So I think that's important to realize that as teachers, we're leading them to these absolutes, hopefully, and leading ourselves, but the finite ways we do it with language and words and writing on the board and all the things we do are somehow just bound up with what we're trying to get them to. Like, it's not just one or the other, and it's all there. It's all beautiful. Just try to make sure that your words don't lead them away from the ultimate. I mean, chances are they're leading them to it. Be careful. That's called ideology. If you want to know a good definition of ideology, that's ideological teaching, ideological institutions. And there are ideological elements in any school because our culture is ideological. It gets in, it contaminates us. We need to fight it, resist it, recognize it, almost be okay with it in some sense because you can't get rid of it. But in the midst of it, recognize all the good you can do and all the good you are doing. Once you have a great text in front of you and some students who want to learn. I've now got students bursting into my door. So
Excellent. Well, very quickly, give us your Twitter handle or anything else that you want people to hear.
Oh, okay. I'm on. I think it's what is my Twitter handle?
I'll find
Thaddeus
it.
J. My username is Thaddeus J. Koz. Thaddeus J. Ko. You can just look up Thaddeus Kozinski. I have a Substack, childrenbewareofidols.substack.com. I have a YouTube channel I don't really use too much. I'm on Facebook, but the Substack and the Twitter, and my new book from En Route Press is available on Amazon. And thanks again, Josh.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Kozinski, for coming on the show today, and hope your students enjoy. We've really benefited here from your coming on the show and your discussion today. So, and thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us here today on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Dr. Thaddeus Kozinski, whose latest book is COVID-19 and the War Against Reality. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you enjoyed this episode, like it and share it with your network. Help others think great ideas. You can find the show on all the platforms, but primarily on X as @TheOptimisticC3, on Facebook and LinkedIn under my name, Josh Herring, and on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to get the next conversation.